Welcome back from lunch. I'm Dave Fina, the guidance counselor of this conference. Woo! Learn, do, teach. I hope you all had fun hanging out at the food trucks, and I also want to thank our lunchtime performers, led by Guillermo Aviles Rodriguez and Maria Dicia, and Rocky the Goat, if you saw the goat. Thank you for that wonderful site-specific piece. It's always important to have a little theater at a theater conference, right? And before I go any further, my team is in all different places and doing all amazing things, and I just have to thank all of them. I have the most amazing team, and we just enjoy working together and doing our own little inside jokes, and they just work so hard, and I just want to lift them up right now. So thanks to the team. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome our next guest to the stage. Philip Himberg is the artistic director of the Sundance Institute Theater Program and also TCG's outgoing board chair. I have to thank Philip for all of his amazing leadership these past years, and we know it's not the end of our working together, so please help me in introducing and welcoming Philip Himberg.
Okay, so keeping with the theme of high school, I am the old, white, gay, aging drama teacher. I'm very honored to present this year's Peter Zeisler Memorial Award. I knew Peter well, and under his stewardship, TCG grew to become the extraordinary organization we all know and love today. His passion for the American theater, for the regional theater, both large and small, is legendary. He paved the way for many of us, including me. When I was starting out, Peter was instrumental in my career development. I received a TCG NEA Artistic Director Fellowship in 1979 at the age of 14. I remember sitting in the old TCG boardroom at my interview. I looked around in that room, and sitting there along with Peter were the lions of the American theater: Gordon Davidson, Duncan Ross, Bill Ball, Adrian Hall, Zelda Fitchhandler. And Peter turned to me after my interview and said, "Well, Philip, at which regional theater do you want to be in residence for a year?" I thought I must imprint this moment, and I have. My choice that day to go out west to LA led me directly, albeit many years later, to my current job at the Sundance Institute, and that I have been privileged to sit on the board of TCG for 7 years and be its chair for 2 is a divine coming home. So thank you, Peter Zeisler. The Peter Zeisler Memorial Award recognizes an individual or organization whose work reflects and promotes the ingenuity and artistic integrity that Peter Zeisler, late executive director of TCG, prized. The honorees exemplify pioneering practices in theater, are dedicated to the freedom of expression, and are unafraid to take risks for the advancement of the art form. Previous recipients include Will Power, Mildred Ruiz and Stephen Sapp of the Universes, Elevator Repair Service, and the Foundry Theater. The recipient of this year's Peter Zeisler Memorial Award is Kinan Valdez, producing artistic director of El Teatro Campesino. Luckily, we were able to hear from the man himself so eloquently and passionately this morning, but a few footnotes. Founded by Luis Valdez, El Teatro Campesino began in 1968, and since 1971, their home has been San Juan Bautista in Central California. There is simply no theater like them in its creation alongside the political and social battlefield of Cesar Chavez and in its ongoing devotion to Chicano traditions. El Teatro Campesino stands in a class of its own. For almost 50 years now, this company has created original work, adapted work, redefined what it means to be a Chicano company, an ethnically specific company, just as it has transcended that moniker and become a beacon and inspiration for all of us. They perform locally, tour statewide, nationwide, and represent us internationally at festivals. The key to their success is access, providing new generations of audiences a connection to art and to culture that is not guaranteed. Many of their youngest members from years back have returned to the company as mature actors and artist workers in the company, a real family. Kinan is literally part of this theatrical family, the son of founder Luis Valdez. Now, for those of you who know classic films, you may remember the 1950 musical A Star is Born with Judy Garland, who sings a song about being born in a trunk in the Princess Theater in Pocatello, Idaho. If Daniel Renner's in the house, he will now sing it for us. Daniel? Kinan was not actually born in a trunk to my mind, but he has a story that I love, which is that as a young boy, he could only fall asleep to the sound of his father writing on an old-fashioned typewriter, tap, tap, tap. And that when Luis transitioned from using an old-fashioned typewriter that made that particular sound to using a word processor that was softer, Kinan actually had to move his sleeping place to the couch closer to his dad so he could fall asleep again, hearing the sound of Luis writing, creating new work. He grew up to be a playwright himself, and an actor, and a director, and a producer. He developed Teatro Lab, an experimental new works lab, and built a mobile educational theater program to reach rural farm working communities. He wrote and directed Ballad of Soldier, El Teatro Campesino's first indie film. Freedom of expression, risk-taking, advancing of the form, genuine, original. These words truly describe the man we honor today. Please join me in congratulating the Peter Zeisler Memorial Awardee, Kinan Valdez.
Thank you. Thank you for this tremendous honor. It is with great honor and humility that I accept this award named after a giant of the American theater. I never had the opportunity to meet Peter personally, but I have heard stories about his energy, his vibrancy, and his vision of a theater of the future from my father, who told me the stories as a young boy. Peter attempted numerous times to recruit my father back in the day into the TCG fold. Someone never to say no for an answer, he finally succeeded in cornering my father. And my father politely said, "Peter, you want me to join TCG? But there is no space for Chicano theater in TCG." And Peter, with a wicked smile and a fire in his eyes, said, "That's exactly why you need to be here." Peter, to me as a man, seems to embody certain key principles that have formed the foundation of my work and the work of El Teatro Campesino and our approach to life. One of those is a Mayan word called winikli. It is the word for human being. It means that we are beings that vibrate. We are not just flesh and blood, but we are creatures of idea, of vitality, of energy. It is our responsibility as human beings to tap into our vibrations, to tap into our powers, to become all that we can be, but also to remember that we have the responsibility of sharing the vibrations that we generate with everybody that we come into contact with. Two, it is the word inlakech. It is a Mayan principle of mutual respect. It means you are my other me. We are all reflections of one another, and we all work together. But it's a profound statement, one of solidarity, but that we all have a commitment to continue making this reflection of each other shine as brightly as we can. And it is so with great humility, I accept this award named after a tremendous winiklil and work and strive with all of you to continue making sure we are pure, perfect, beautiful reflections of one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Kinan, and thank you, Philip. I'm particularly thrilled to welcome our next speakers to the stage. Last year, I saw a fair amount of theater, but there was one production in particular that stuck with me. Disgraced by Ayad Akhtar follows a corporate lawyer coming to terms with his multiple identities at a difficult dinner party. I was shaken in the theater in tears on the way home, and haven't stopped thinking about it since. So, when Disgraced was named the 2013 Pulitzer Prize winner for drama, I was like, that's right. And I'm pleased to share that American Theater Magazine will be publishing the play in the July-August issue, so check that out. Ayad is also an actor, novelist, teacher, and screenwriter, and he will be joined in conversation with Gabriel Greene, the director of new play development at La Jolla Playhouse, where Ayad's The Who and the What will be produced in February of next year. So please join me in welcoming Ayad Akhtar and Gabriel Greene to the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, yeah, wow. Big
So-
crowd.
Yeah. I have a story similar to the one Defina just told. The way I got to know Ayad and his work, in February of 2012, I got a phone call late one night from my mother, who had just left the theater after the performance. She didn't walk out. She had attended an early performance of Disgraced, an American theater company in Chicago where the play got its premiere. And she said, if you haven't heard of this writer, you have to remedy that immediately. And I feel like this is the story of 2012 for you. You came seemingly out of nowhere. Your first novel, American Dervish, published January 9th, went on to be named Best Book of 2012 by numerous publications, including, not insignificantly, Oprah Magazine. We know what power she wields. But that same month, Disgraced premieres an American theater company. Scarcely a month later, your second play, The Invisible Hand, premieres at the Repertory Theater in St. Louis. Seth Gordon in the house. Disgraced moves to Lincoln Center Theater 3. It's scheduled for production in London, which has since opened. And then, of course, the Pulitzer Prize. You know, Teresa said something yesterday, a simile that I want to take. It's like you had sprung fully formed from the head of Zeus, and yet you were...
The head of Aphrodite.
Yeah, and you're 41. So how do you process the craziness of this last year?
I don't know. I think I'm still in the process of processing it. I, of course, feel incredibly grateful for all of the attention that the work has gotten. You know, I think that one of the stories of, I've been doing this for a long time. You know, I at the age of 15 knew I wanted to be a writer. I had this amazing high school teacher who changed my life. Up until that point, my parents are both doctors, and up until that point, I'd been sort of trained like a little automaton to repeat that I'm going to be a neurosurgeon when I grow up. And this high school teacher completely changed my life, and I knew I wanted to be a writer, so I've basically been doing it since then. And you know, since I got out of college, been trying to do it professionally, so 20 years now. And I think one of the stories or one of the through lines of that 20 years has been just learning how to do it better. I was at Beverly Hills High School a couple days ago where they read American Dervish as their all-school read at the end of the year, and one of the students was saying, I want to be a writer, do you have any guidance for me, or do you have any ideas or thoughts on, you know, what I should be thinking about? And I said perseverance. And I said, if I break down my career into 4 stages, it's basically I spent a lot of years writing really badly and thinking that I was writing well. And then I spent a bunch of years after that realizing I'd been writing pretty badly and getting better. And then the third period was, I'm writing better, but nobody's paying any attention. And then finally, there's been this recent period where I think I'm writing better and people are starting to pay some attention. So, you know, it's always strange to try to account for the fact that, you know, I've been doing this for a very long time, but of course, all of a sudden now folks are aware of who I am. But I'm very grateful.
You mentioned the high school teacher who provided a transformative experience. So in what way did that teacher reach out to you? Or?
You know, when I met her, it was a lit class, it was a world lit class, and everybody in school sort of knew that she She'd changed so many kids' lives. And by the time I'd met her, she was in her late 50s. She'd been through 5 husbands. She lived on 40 acres of land north of Milwaukee, where she tended a farm-sized garden every morning at 4 a.m. before coming into school. And when she came into class, she had this sort of regal bearing that was like, it was not affectation. It was, I recognize now what it was. I didn't know what it was at the time, but it was this sort of resonance of somebody who's really firmly and fully committed to authenticity, to living an authentic life. And that is the resonance that changed so many people. And it changed me. She got me hooked on reading. She got me thinking about the deeper questions of life. And it just struck me as self-evidently the most extraordinary thing that I could do was to give myself to that process of asking those questions and putting it into narrative form. Yeah. The other thing that she did too, which is something which is amazing, but it also took me a long time to sort of get over, was she sort of introduced me to a lot of European modernism. And so I was reading, Thomas Mann and Rilke and Kafka and Robert Musil and the existentialists and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and I read so much by the time I got out of high school. But I carried with me for at least a good 10 to 15 years this idea that writing in a universal way was like writing like a Central European modernist. And so in a way, the issues that, or let's say my own experience, write what you know, as it were, which I think is, of course, it's very good advice, but I didn't take it for a long time because I just thought, well, what I know is not universal and nobody's going to really care about what I know. And it doesn't seem worthy of this very high calling of the questions of the meaning of life and what have you. So it took me a long time to work that out.
Right, and so we did, The Who and the What was originally programmed in this reading series that we did last year as part of the DNA New Work series, a very first draft that had been sent to us. And so Ayad came out.
I didn't even know you had it.
Yes, that's right. I kept bugging his agent for the longest time to send me something new, and apparently he did so without Ayad's knowledge, so thank you to him.
I just didn't think it was ready. But.
So Ayad came out with Kimberly Sr., who directed this reading, and it was a day-long process, unfortunately, just a day to dig under the incredible ideas that are in this play. And we did a reading for a group of people, and the conversation that we had afterwards was just fantastically moving and exciting, and just a wonderful dialogue with the audience. And at that conversation, you shared a story with the audience about that transformation from not thinking that what you were writing was worthy of sharing. And
right.
Do you mind sharing?
No, sure, yeah. I'm not sure exactly what the moment of realization was, but it was sometime in my early 30s that I started to sense that I was avoiding something. I was avoiding something about where I came from, about who I was. It was something I was avoiding in my work, but I was also avoiding it as at the level of identity. I guess I had been doing this thing, writing long enough that maybe that's why the thing constellated itself the way it did, which was that I think, had enough presence of mind to realize that the best way to respond to this growing awareness was just to be still about it and to see what happened. And at some point, I, metaphorically speaking, sort of just started to turn to look over my shoulder at what I was running from. And in that moment, again, metaphorically speaking, there was this burst of creativity. I mean, it was an explosion. And so the matter of working through personal psychological identity issues or whatever, what have you, actually happened through the work or with the work. And American Dervish came from that moment. Disgrace did. The Who and the What did. A novel I'm working on now. A film that I'm writing now as well. So all of that stuff came from that encounter, as it were.
Mm. There's so many. You work in so many different forms. You've got the novel. You continue to write screenplays, and so you were a theater major at Brown, mm-hmm. and then you did graduate work at Columbia in film directing. And also a novelist in your non-existent spare time, I imagine.
I don't have a personal life. That's all.
Well, that's good.
It makes it a lot easier.
So like, just turning to this duality between theater and film, were you always attracted to both media?
You know, yes and no. I fell in love with the theater when I was in college. I mean, I didn't, you know, I grew up in Milwaukee and my folks are Pakistani doctor immigrants, and, you know, like down when Disgraced was opening in Chicago, my parents had never seen a play that I'd been in or done, so, but they were close enough because they live in Milwaukee that they drove down, and apparently my dad was complaining the whole way down. He's like, why am I going to go see people pretending something? I don't want to see. I know it's my son, he did it, but I don't want to be bored by, they're not doing anything. And my mom and my brother were basically like, will you shut up and just, you know, I'm driving, okay, I'm taking you, so. He loved it, you know, at the end of the play, he walked out, his eyes were all puffy and red and swollen, and he was, you know, he looked at me and just said, yeah, very, very, very well done. Which was, you know, obviously very gratifying. But so I grew up in a household where, you know, theater was not part of, you know, it was, Dallas was what we did. Dallas was actually what we...
The TV show.
The TV show, yeah. On Friday nights, you know, it was like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? And Sue Ellen, how does she put up with JR? And, you know what I mean? But in college, I just fell in love with the theater, and so many of my rites of passage as a young man, and I think basically as an American too, I would say, happened in the theater. But that said, I think aesthetically what was innate to me, or what's native, is the film form, or let's say the television form. And so there's always been this kind of back and forth in terms of, it's taken me another one of the stories of that 20 years has been the erosion of the divide between high and low. Mm-hmm. You know, I think I held much more firmly to this notion of a high versus a low, and I don't really take it that seriously anymore, as folks I think who've seen Disgraced probably will sense. It plays to the audience in a very unusual way, I think, at times. And I think that, so to me, finding that vitality or finding the connection to the audience, which is yet another through line of those 20 years, is, you know, writing in a way where I basically think of art, I think I thought of art as self-expression. And then there was some shift into art as engagement with the audience, engagement with the world. And I think film has been an important part of understanding how audiences process narrative in our time. I think of movies as the dominant storytelling form. And I think unconsciously 3-act film structure is basically how everyone processes narrative. I think that we're talking basically in the American theater, we're really talking about 2-act structure, which is different, so it's unusual. And I think one of the things that maybe people find exciting about Disgraced, and maybe one of the things that some folks have a problem with, is that it is 3-act structure, you know, which basically means set up, then your story, resolution, as opposed to the body in which you enter, as Paul Schrader would say, in writing a scene, you come to the party late and you leave early.
Right.
So.
There's so many. We were having a conversation about a week or so when you were out in San Diego for auditions, and we were talking about film. We have His Girl Friday playing right now, and we were talking about Howard Hawks, the movie version, and within a 5-minute conversational span, Ayad was talking about French New Wave cinema, you know, I think Tarantino, Howard Hawks, Preston Sturges, just like such a wide, you're a student of such a wide array of movies. And you talk a little bit about the 3-act structure and some of that continuity elements. But, you know, were there any specific directors or types of films that inspire you as a writer, both in film or in theater?
Yeah, Scorsese. And because, and basically on some level, Goodfellas, I think is what that's the film that, you know, I'm working on a novel now, which is basically an attempt to write my version of Goodfellas. I mean, it's not about gangsters or, I mean, it's funny, it's like the who and the what was, I wanted to write Annie Hall set in the Muslim American community. Of course, it has nothing to do with Annie Hall, but I get very inspired by these sorts of projects, these impossible projects. But yeah, Scorsese, because of the percussiveness of the storytelling, the velocity of it, I find that Goodfellas is one of those films that I am never bored by. The richness of detail, of course, yes, but the movement of the story, the narrative movement, which mirrors a kind of quickness of the narrative movement or the movement of the mind. So Scorsese's been huge. You know, I think in film in general, I think I'm kind of OCD, but I have channeled it maybe at times into more productive things. In my mid-20s, I decided that I didn't know enough about film history, so you know, I had a little bit of a chunk of change, not a whole lot, but a little bit, and I just holed myself up in a room for 3.5 months and watched 6 movies a day. And I worked through the 30s, the 40s, I worked through the French New Wave, through Italian neo-realists, through the 70s independent films, and, you know, kind of came out of that experience bleary-eyed, but also, you know, having ingested this history of this storytelling form in cinema, which is basically what has informed us in our relationship to story.
And do you find that, having worked as a screenwriter and been on set and the various demands that attend that, has that influenced the process of your writing, the way that you write or rewrite?
I think that one of the things that people find surprising, at least that I have found that people seem to find surprising about working with the American theater, is that I am basically like, oh, the scene doesn't work, does it? And okay, let's rewrite it. And that seems very natural to me because I've worked in the film business, basically eked out a living writing screenplays in the film business, where when you get notes, if you don't change the scene, you get fired. So the job is to try to find a way to make a scene work for the demand and to do it, I think, as well as you can. And I don't know, 8 times out of 10, to me, in my experience, it actually does make the scene better. Again, that sort of narrative through line of those 20 years of learning how to write, a lot of that, there was a huge growth process of working with producers who really understood story, and I learned from that process of having to rewrite work. So to me, as an artist who's fundamentally interested in engaging the audience, not boring the audience is really the most direct way of putting it, I think that the feedback, the immediate feedback of collaborators and of the audience, readings and previews and whatnot, is so essential to the process of making the work live.
When you talked about Scorsese, you talked about that percussive element of storytelling, and certainly in Disgraced, that percussive quality is there. So when you metaphorically slowed down to allow whatever was chasing you to catch up, and you were rushed with these flood of stories, you wrote Disgraced first.
Yeah.
What was it about Disgraced that made it the most urgent story to tell?
Amir is this character, this corporate lawyer, who's at the center of the play, and it began with a monologue of his, and it was so insistent, and he seemed to embody so many of, I joke about the play, its concussive 90-minute sort of impact belies a very complex architecture in terms of metaphor or meaning architecture, and it's taken me a long time to understand the play. And I've been writing it. It took me 2 years to understand what in God's name this was really about. Because I think Amir was such a strong voice and such a strong, insistent voice that I just kept having to follow him into these places that I couldn't make sense of.
Was it a specific monologue? That monologue may have just been a little formless at the time that it came to you, but did it survive into the play?
No, it's actually now in the Who and the What.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I'll have to make note
But
of
it's
that.
funny how these things happen. You know, I was just at McDowell, and I had gone there because I've had this crazy schedule because of this amazing year, but I haven't had any time to write. And I got 5 weeks at McDowell, and I basically told everybody I can't do anything, leave me alone. And I went there to work on this new book that I'm working on, and I had written 3.5 chapters of it. I got there and I started writing, and I realized it wasn't working. It wasn't giving me the same kind of energy that I needed to be able to continue working. I went through 3 days of sort of torturing myself over it and finally just sort of said, okay, well, if that's what it is, then that's what it is. I'll let it go. Late that night, I went back to my studio, started to hear a voice, and I started writing. And I wrote 1 sentence, 2, and then I had 5 pages, and the next day I had another 5. And then I found a file hidden in a folder on my desktop, hidden in another folder, which was 300 pages of notes on a novel that I had taken 8 years ago and just put aside and totally forgotten about. And suddenly, this was the thing that was now coming out of me. Characters had switched places without me realizing it, and now it had taken this shape, and it was just sort of, so it's like the nature of how inspiration sort of works and winds its way through you. I started with a monologue that Amir was speaking that ended up in a different play, but that has led him to the portal where he tells a different story, and you know what I mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, the play, for those obviously who've seen it or read it, tackles a lot of incendiary subjects. And one of the first things I read, there's a New York Times profile that was written about you in which the writer, in referencing Disgraced, takes one specific sentence of the play and plugs it in, which...
Amir calls the Quran one very long hate mail letter to humanity.
Yes.
It's supposed to be a joke, guys.
Right.
So, and usually the audience laughs.
But that is the thing. It's like...
Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they go, whoa.
Taking that line out of context, as she did, can lead to problematic, the way people receive what this play is trying to do. I mean, is it difficult as a writer for you to see the conversation, the larger conversation that you're trying to have, be distilled to sound bites that ignore that larger context?
Theoretically, yes, but actually, no, because, excuse me, I'm grappling with a cold, so. I think that one of the things that artists can do, and one of the things that artists do when they do well, and the way that they most effectively, or can most effectively, participate with the social body, and perhaps fulfill that calling that Shelley suggests for them, that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind, is by opening up spaces that are emotionally rich, multivalent, and which cannot be reduced to soundbite. That is to say, for the audience that has witnessed the work. People who are going to comment on that work and sort of rightly or wrongly, tell other people to go or not go, or that this is what this is about, or people who are going to use that work as a pretext to some other end. It's in their job description to go ahead and try to distill and to create a soundbite that's going to catch attention, that's going to keep people reading on the internet or whatever it may be. But I think that the good news is that when an artist is able to put together an aesthetic experience for an audience that has that kind of richness, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what people are going to say about it as long as audiences have the opportunity to experience it.
And for those audiences who have experienced it in Chicago, New York, London, and maybe it's different in all three of those cities, but what are the most common types of reactions that you get from audience members?
I think that the thing I think that there have been a lot of different ones, but I think that one of the dominant strains has been, the play's an attempt to, it starts off as basically, I hope, a smart sitcom, and then it kind of moves into an idea play, which then kind of becomes a romantic thriller, which then kind of becomes a melodrama, which then kind of becomes agitprop, and finally turns into this romantic, tragic love story, right? So that's the kind of basic form of this.
You got all that?
Well, but it's not an intellectual thing. It's just the way the narrative is processing, the way that the audience is relating to it, and I think that there's the level of engagement that audiences have had in Chicago and New York and London has been amazing to me. But they have been different in different ways. They've been different in different places. The one through line I've noticed is that people are incredibly moved by the play. So they get to the end of it and there's a sense of being moved. I was, this is going to sound very pretentious, which I often am, but I remember reading Aristotle on tragedy, years and years ago, and his idea, his definition of catharsis, which is very different than what we call catharsis. Catharsis in the Aristotelian sense has to do with the expression of emotion through pity and terror, terror being key. And terror, as he defines it, his paradigmatic anecdote is When the Furies arrived on stage, women were miscarrying in the aisles. Now, right? Who wants to go to a theater like that, right? Well, I do. That kind of visceral, there's a visceral response that is the result of an engagement that is both religious and mass. It's a mass form. Tragedy was a mass form for the Greeks. And so, inspired by that very lofty thought, I wanted to create a tragic arc, but that was not noble and detached. Not the split off between horror and melodrama that has happened, but something else, something that could maybe, reach an audience in a much more immediate way. And so I think that one of the things that's been very gratifying is that there have been a bunch of people who've come out of the theater unaccountably moved, and they don't understand why, and that's the whole point.
Do you, in rereading Disgraced on the way here, it reminded me of W.E.B. Du Bois talking about double consciousness, the idea that people see themselves through the lens of the dominant culture.
Right.
And you, in this forthcoming interview in American Theater Magazine, you talk about this play, the journey of this play being about how Muslims are still very beholden to the way that they're viewed in the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the play's about a lot of things, and hopefully in a good way, but I think that certainly one of the things, the play begins with a Western artist painting a Muslim subject, and the play ends with that Muslim subject seeing that painting. So in between those 2 points is a journey that has to do with the politics of representation of the Muslim other, which of course has a long history. One of the things that people have been confused by at times by the play and by some of the other work that I'm doing is it's not clear where I stand on these matters. And so it's clear that I'm not an apologist, or I'm not involved in some PR that is about correcting some impression people have of Islam. But that's because my position is that as an artist, I have to have the freedom to wrestle with my demons and my raptures and those of my community, and to celebrate and criticize in equal measure. And that I don't want, the best way to sort of tell a good story about the world that I come from is not to be worried about the politics of representation, except insofar as it's important to the characters that I'm representing.
Right.
But that said, I think that, it's a very long story, for Edward Said, calls it Orientalism for a few centuries now. The West has had a dominant sort of discourse that defines the Muslim other in a way that allows it to justify its political practices and justify a more sense of moral superiority. And so, in a post-9/11 landscape where the Muslim other is even more pejoratively defined, what is the role of a Muslim American artist of some visibility in that discursive environment? And my relationship to that question is by no means obvious.
Right.
And even to me, actually, to be honest.
Well, and I just want to move to the who and the what now, because it does also grapple with Muslim ideology and also very specific tenets. I just wonder,
it is a comedy, though, Gabe.
It is a comedy.
Yeah,
Can I say, for the sake of my wife who's in marketing, let me say it's a comedy.
Yes. What do you mean for her sake? What about for my sake?
First of all, just so we have a little bit of context to the play, can you talk a little bit about the inspiration for the who and the what, and what briefly it's about?
Yeah, I have this other play called The Invisible Hand, which I had finished my draft of on a given day. So this is the inspiration really unfolded kind of in a furious way. But anyway, so I finished that draft, and I was taking a cab home, and I saw, the little TVs they have in the cabs? I saw this ad for Kiss Me Kate, and I thought to myself, what is this obsession with Taming of the Shrew? It makes no sense. People, the gender politics of that play have no resonance for today's audiences. Why do people keep doing this play? Right? And I thought to myself, Oh, but you know what? I know that's the gender politics of that play. I understand them because that's where I come from. That's my culture. I mean, my mom is basically Kate, you know, nicer version, but you know, didn't want to get married, and her father said, you've got to get married because you've got 3 sisters behind you, and if you don't get married, nobody's going to marry your sisters. And it was the worst decision she ever made, apparently, so she thinks. But, so I thought to myself, you know what, I should write a knockoff of Taming of the Shrew, where there's, you know, 2 sisters, and older sister's sworn off love, younger sister's got a boyfriend, she wants to marry him, father says, you're not marrying your boyfriend until your older sister gets married. Set up this dramatic situation. There's a Muslim-American family in Atlanta, 2 girls born in America, very American girls, but grappling with, and then, so coming into this whole thing, I wanted to write, you know, a romantic comedy or a relationship film about Muslim-American matrimonial mores, and I wanted it to be like Annie Hall. So that was the whole thing, right? I was like really excited about this, and I failed on the Annie Hall part, but I think it's it's an interesting failure. So that's where the inspiration for the play came from, and then of course there's this other thing which is going to sound very, I don't know, ponderous, and maybe it is. I don't think it is, but the whole meditation on the prophet and the prophet's example about, you know, how Muslims approach the questions of love and commitment and matrimony and relationship as informed by the example of the prophet. And Zarina, who is the older sister who's sworn off love, basically is writing a book that is deconstructing the prophet. She's a comp lit major, and her father doesn't know that she's writing this book, and so.
And so through her, you're tackling this, you know, an ideology, and I wonder, as a writer whose job it is to interrogate things like ideologies, which by definition don't like to be interrogated, how do you hope to have a conversation in that constricture?
The great thing about doing theater, this is the great, and like one of the great things, is that I can write a play, and then a group of students in Indonesia can sit around a table and read it, and then decide they want to do it. And if they can't do it publicly because it's going to start a riot, they can do it in a basement, and they can invite people over. The who and the what is something that I hope that folks find it meaningful enough and entertaining enough and interesting enough to engage with it. It's a different kind of fostering of dialogue, or if I say art as not as self-expression, but as engagement with the world. Writing a play is a completely different kind of engagement with the world because you're engaging other people to engage with the work. The Enlightenment was spread, you know, in the 17th and 18th centuries through a process that was similar. Reading groups, basically book clubs, what we now call book clubs. Folks would get together and read the latest by Voltaire or by Rousseau, and would discuss it, and then pass the book to another person who then. And it's that sort of movement of consciousness through presence, not through virtuality, but presence, which again is another thing I think is so central to the theater, and which its importance and how the starkness of its importance is so clear in the contemporary world. Because we live in a world that is so completely mediated by screens that the counterpoint of authentic presence does not have to be argued for anymore. It's self-evident. Did that answer your question?
Yes. There's so much. I'm getting like the time flashes that warn me we're heading to Q&A, which is going to be great. But I jealously want to ask you a few more questions before we get there. We skipped over Invisible Hand, which I didn't mean to do.
No, that's fine.
It has at its core this incredible premise, which is an American banker who's kidnapped and held for ransom in Pakistan, strikes a deal with his captors whereby he secures his life by agreeing to teach them how to manipulate and exploit, the global financial markets in order to fund their activity. And it's in terms of the way that it examines both religious extremism and also holds it alongside capitalism, which has its own profits, PH, not F, and its own extremism, really. Right. How did you come to this idea?
I I was sitting on a couch and I just thought about, just thinking about a hostage thriller, and I'd been reading a lot about the financial crisis. Finance has always been a big theme for me. My dad, when I got out of college and moved to New York, my dad promised that he would pay my rent if I read the Wall Street Journal every day. So for 2 years, I basically read the Wall Street Journal every day. And I learned a lot about finance, and I think I sort of very early on came to the conclusion that you couldn't really understand the world we were living in unless you really understood the financial world, because, you know, I don't know, 800 years ago, if you talk about a dominant reigning ideology that governed nations and governed individuals' relationships with one another, you could call it the church. And today, the dominant ideology, that which governs nations and governs individuals' relationships with one another, is the economy. That's the same, it's functioning in the same quasi-mythological way. And so that's always been a theme for me, is finance. And I think things, you know, an idea for a play or a movie or a book, to me, it's not just one thing, it's like when 4 things come together. So that was, I think, something that happened, and yeah, so.
And when you did, so this premiered at Repertory Theater of St. Louis, and I know that you recently did a rewrite, which incorporated like just a ton of changes. Just, you know, there's this frustration that, a real frustration that the only more difficult thing to accomplish than getting a first production is to get that second production. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from that and how it's influenced the rewrite?
I'm just amazed by, I mean, now I've been through Disgraced with three productions. And the first production basically showed me what I did. I didn't even, I mean, the production in Chicago, I didn't know what I had done until I saw the production. And until I saw the audience react to it, until I read what folks said about it. And I was like, oh, this is what this is. And so, and I did a huge rewrite going into Lincoln Center. And felt much clearer about what it was, and then did some more work on it before London as well. And I think I pretty much get what this thing is, but production has been an important part of that. So to me, I think one of the real awakenings has been how much the first production is really just something that tells me what it is, as opposed to the finishing or the completion of the work. You know, that's a tough proposition, I get that, but you know, I'm just speaking truthfully, that's all.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, so before we open it up, you just to return back to that initial, that spark where you stopped running, all of these stories flooded towards you. You've said, in addition to American Dervish and Disgraced and Invisible Hand and The Who and the What, there's another novel, or maybe 2, there's a screenplay, another play. Do you feel at a certain point that you're going to continue, you know, to see what comes up, or is there a point where you have other ideas that are less centered on that sense of identity that you're interested in?
My mom, about 3 weeks ago, called me and she said, Ayad, you have to stop it with this Muslim thing, okay? So I was like, Mom, I don't choose my subjects. I mean, this is just what's happening, and I have to just obey it. I suspect that there's going to be, I sense that there's some material in the offing which seems to be less ethnocentric and perhaps more thematically centered around perhaps fathers or something like that. I can sense that seems to be coming. I'm not engaging too much with it right now because I have these other things that I've got to do. But I don't worry about it. I mean, I feel like one of the advantages of having struggled for as long as I have and had as rough a time as I did for a while is that I'm just very grateful that anybody's paying attention, and I don't expect that it's necessarily going to last, and that's fine. What's kept me going through all of it is knowing that this is what I really was put here to do, and that I'm just going to keep doing that to the best of my ability, and hopefully I'll get better. I mean, that's what I hope. So,
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop hogging him. We've got 2 people, I believe, with microphones on either side. So please, if you have a question, just raise your hand and one of them will come to you.
Hi, I'm Jay McAdams from 24th Street Theater in LA. You were talking that great image of the women miscarrying in the aisles.
Yeah.
We're in the TYA, Theater for Young Audiences panel yesterday. We were talking about that, about just how far you can go. It's a big issue in Theater for Young Audiences, just about the rigor and how far do you dare to go on topics and issues and whatnot. I just wondered what your opinion is on that.
How far you can dare to go.
Yeah, with regard to rigorous content for young audiences. It's a big tent. There's a lot of thought in the field about it, but I mean, obviously, you don't really want people miscarrying in the aisles. But I mean, there are people. We just did a play called "Walking the Tightrope" from Mike Kinney, British playwright, and it deals with death and grief. And there are some in the TYA world who say, "Oh, you just can't." You shouldn't really say that, talk about that with kids. I disagree, but that's my version of miscarrying in the aisles.
I see.
I wonder what you think about it.
Well, I don't know that I have any thoughts specifically to theater for young audiences because I don't write for that audience. I do think that shocking for shock's sake is not particularly interesting to me personally. When Aristotle is talking about women miscarrying in the aisles, he's talking about a religious sense of awe. In the Islamic tradition, the word for God-fearing is the same as God, awe of God. And if you can begin to provoke that numinous dimension for an audience, then I think you're not necessarily working to the end of shocking them for shock's sake, but trying to open them up to the deeper level of existence. There was a Scottish-born Pakistani Muslim woman who came to see Disgraced in London and sent me a very long email a couple of weeks ago. She said, I'm very confused by this play. It has put me in a state of weird depression that I can't seem to let go. I seem to be seeing things more clearly, but I'm very troubled by what I'm seeing. And I wrote her back and I said, I'm so sorry that you're having this experience that feels, depressing to you, but I think that it might be partly by design. That is to say that if I could find someone with whom this work would resonate, that it might drop them to a deeper level of reflection about where the world is. And so, again, it's not about wanting to affect them simply for that sake, but because there is a higher reason for it. Rainer Werner Fassbinder, the great new wave German filmmaker, once said, I wish to create revolution, not on screen, but in the audience. The only way to do that, I think, is to present something troubling, thorny, which the audience on an emotional level cannot release. Meaning is not going to release this trouble. I'm reminded of a great Hindu parable in which a man who loves God goes to God and says, God, you know how much I love you, right? And God says, oh, yeah, no, I know you love me a lot. And he says, so great, so how many lifetimes is it going to take for me to achieve liberation or moksha? And God says, well, it's going to take you 7. He said, oh, okay, well, if I hated you, how many would it take? God says, well, if you really hated me, it would take you 3. God says, why? Because if you hated me, you'd think about me more. If you can leave the audience with a question that they cannot release, that they have to think about, because they wake up in the morning just thinking about it, that sets in motion a process of consciousness at an individual level, which I can't control, but I just give it up to God, whatever. I'm just playing my part in that process, or I'm trying to.
Are there other? Oh.
Hi,
Oh,
thank you.
Then yell.
Yell.
Thank you. Susan Serrano, MBA. So when you're talking about, 9/11 and what effect it had on your writing or your direction, you might say, and I look at somebody like, say, Tamim Ansari, who clearly 9/11 made him, the writer he is because of the email that went viral kind of thing. But in your case, you have so much going on as a writer, and I don't know, I'm just curious. Did the 9/11 experience push you into the quote, what you know, and yet it still kind of feels like by going with women, you're still globalizing in a way that certainly speaks to me, so that it isn't just what you know. Is that any part of it?
Thank you for that. The question had, for those of you who didn't hear it, the question was basically, 9/11 has that pushed you into this matter of what you know, are you? Let me understand the second part. Are you concerned that, and are you pushing?
Yeah, it feels as though even as though you're saying, okay, I finally had to do what they told me to, write what I know.
Yeah.
And 9/11 becomes some kind of pop trigger for that, which is wonderful. But at the same time, it still feels that you're trying to go away to diverge.
I see. I understand your question. Thank you. Yes. It's complicated. I'm not sure 9/11 was the only trigger. I think it certainly was part of it. And because the climate changed so much, that making sense of my place in the new world brought up a lot of things. So I don't know that I was necessarily in dialogue with 9/11 per se, at least on a conscious level. But I think as a reigning defining event for a shift in the world, yes, absolutely. The second question is really very important. I'm so glad you asked because it's something that I wanted to say, which is that I am trying to write to the universal. That is what I am trying to do, period, end of story. I don't believe that stories about Muslim Americans and Muslims are people too, and I just don't think that that's particularly, that can't necessarily reach everybody in the audience where they live and breathe at the bottom of their guts and in their heart. It can illuminate things for them, but it can't necessarily force them to ask the questions of their own life that I think we are all, it's incumbent on all of us to ask, the deepest questions. And so what I think I've discovered, look, who knows what I've discovered, and they give me some prize and suddenly I think I know something. But what I hope that I'm discovering is that by writing from the particular that I know and that I find fascinating and have a lot of love for and a whole lot of problems with, I can perhaps open onto the universal, which was something that I couldn't do before when I was trying to write in some universal way. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you.
My name is Julianne Otis. I'm from Boston, and I want to thank you both for being here. My experience in creating theater is one in which I simply show up and am a conduit for the divine operating through me. And I think a lot of people in this room would probably understand what I mean by that. Maybe some don't, but out in the world when I talk about how I create, oftentimes there's a glaze that goes over people's faces when I speak about my creativity and my spirituality being exactly the same thing.
Right.
And a lot of what you were speaking about, not only in the universality, but in the spirituality of how you create, it not being an intellectual process or a cognitive process, but that you really are just showing up and being there and the work is created through you. I find it very inspiring, so first I want to thank you for talking in that way.
Okay.
But secondly, I'm looking to expand that conversation, not only for us as artists, but for audience members to be able to have access to open up to that creativity for themselves. So I'm just wondering if you have any ideas about how to expand that dialogue, make it more available for artists to show up and have that work operate through them, and how to make spirituality not this strange word, not this word to be afraid of.
Very deep question. Thank you. Here's my thought on it for what it's worth. I am a very religious person, as it were. But I think that anybody who would encounter my work might not quite see that or understand what the connection is. I think if you dig a little deeper, you probably would see that connection. But I think one of the things that spirituality gets a bad name because, at times, because I think that it seems to suggest that there's a Pollyannish view of life. And I think that credibility even within spiritual circles, has something to do with opening up to the dimension of dissonance, or what we would call evil. And I think that as artists, William Faulkner once said, literature worthy of the name must deal with the question of evil. Opening up to the possibility of dissonance is not concordant with what people generally understand to be spirituality. But that's where the interesting work is. And so if faith, as action, not as belief, if faith gives us the strength to open onto the questions, as John Keats would say, to have negative capability, not to reach irritably for answers, then it's doing a lot of good for us. If it's an ideology, if it's about making the audience feel empowered, then it's on some level perhaps very well-meaning propaganda. I mean, that's basically, and it loses credibility because they're like, you know what, this has nothing to do with the fact that I can't pay my rent.
Question about Ralph Remington, National Endowment for the Arts. How are you? Great to see you here, and congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Often artists of color, people of color within our own communities, or people in ethnically specific, culturally specific communities, talk in politically incorrect ways among ourselves to ourselves. But we often don't see that portrayed on stage. What I'm asking is, did you get any pushback from the Muslim community, or what kind of pushback, if any, did you get for airing dirty laundry in this grade?
I get a ton of pushback from, but the good news is I get a lot of the other thing too. And so, basically, what my response is, I'm just trying to, I don't get a lot of, this is not happening. It's basically that same thing of, I think, post-Holocaust, post-Second World War, very, very dominant discourse amongst the, Jewish American community. Certainly Philip Roth dealt with it, what's good for the Jews, what's bad for the Jews. Let's not do things that are bad for the Jews. And there's a similar thing going on now in the Muslim community. It's totally understandable. Unfortunately, I lose any credibility as an artist, not only with my audience, but with myself, if I am catering to a political ideology one way or the other. My calling is to try to tell the most truthful story in the most compelling way. Both are very important, the pleasure part of it and the truth part of it. And so that's what most of my time is spent dealing with that, and then I deal with the consequences later when people see the work and they're upset with me, so.
I think we have time for just one more, but I do want to also say that Ayad is going to be signing copies of American Dervish, so feel free to go grab a copy of that great novel, get him to sign it, and then you can ask him another question there. It'll take forever, it'll be great.
One over here.
Hi, I'm Stephen Foglia. I'm with Undermain Theater here in Dallas, and I'm curious, writing for film and theater and also novels, first, how does a project that is coming to you, how does it tell you which form it ought to be in? And then I'm curious as well how you respond to a tension between wanting to protect the integrity of the borders between those forms, say wanting to make a cinematic movie that is not infected by stage conventions and vice versa, or on the other hand, wanting to penetrate those borders and, in fact, to bring the innovations from each form into the other one.
I almost feel like I'm more interested in your thoughts on this matter. The first part is pretty easy to answer, which is every idea seems to have a kind of natural inclination. Fiction seems to imply some kind of interiority. There's a being withness of the characters that theater seems to evoke, and there's a kind of inarticulateness of the film form which works for other ideas. And so each of these, there's something about the movement of a story that begins to, begins to become clear. I think for the second part of it, I'm not sure I have enough awareness of my relationship to form to really answer it in as eloquent a way as you asked the question. But what I can offer is that I think I have been very informed by the process of understanding story as it unfolds in a film form and how that has influenced how I approach the theater and fiction. So I think that I'm in some ways still continually beholden to the telling of stories in the cinematic form, at least let's call it 3-act structure. But I think as I'm growing as a playwright and also as a novelist, I think I'm pushing into terrain. You know, I think American Dervish is basically a movie in book form. And not because I wanted it to become a movie, but because I yearned for that directness of engagement with the reader that could only come, it seemed to me, from that. But I think there's probably other ways to get there, and that more accomplished novelists find ways to do that, and I hope that I'm on the trajectory to become one of those. So that's basically, you know, that's my 2 cents about that. So.
Right. Well, thank you so much for sitting down to chat with us.
You.
It was great.
Thank you, Ayad. Thank you, Gabe. That was so great. As Gabriel said, for me, there will be a book signing in the TCG bookstore right now. And speaking of book signings, David Henry Wong will also be signing books tonight after the premiere of Yellowface, which is happening at 5 p.m. here, which is the YouTube film version of his play, Yellowface, starting at 5 p.m. Also, I think we mentioned that Luis Valdez is speaking at 7 p.m. at the Latino Cultural Center. We were able to add a shuttle route to the Latino Cultural Center from the Sheraton. So that'll be running from 5 to 7 from the Sheraton to the LLC. I also encourage you to take part in some of the dine-arounds that are going on. There was just one added today, I believe, so you should stop by the hospitality table to get more information about that. It's a great way to meet fellow attendees and discover some of the great non-food truck culinary options Dallas has to offer. And next up, we have a half-hour coffee break. Stop by the book signing, and then where are you going? Homerooms, yes. And what? It's important to stay with your homeroom the entire time. So enjoy, and class dismissed.